On the 11th of February 1923, the most famous Jew in the world took to the stage. Albert Einstein had come to Palestine as an honored guest to commemorate the opening of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Granted, the university had actually been founded in 1918, and it didn't actually open until 1925. It wasn't even Palestine's first university, but I suppose it's the thought that counts. Just as Sir Moses Montefiore a century earlier had envisioned Palestine as a refuge for Jews fleeing persecution, Zionist organization President Chaim Weizmann had envisioned the Hebrew University as a refuge for Jews who had been denied admission to universities due to discrimination. And it was one of several loosely affiliated Jewish institutions that suddenly found themselves filling the administrative vacuum created by the failure of High Commissioner Herbert Samuel's Palestinian Constitution. Before going forward, I'd like to give an overview of some of these bodies, since they're going to be important for everything that comes afterward. Longtime viewers of this channel will probably be most familiar with the Zionist Organization, the executive arm of the near-annual Zionist Congress in Europe, now led by Weizmann. A couple decades earlier, the Congress had played an important role in bringing Zionist thinkers together, but they'd never held much influence over Jewish politics within Palestine, and the establishment of the mandate had rendered it virtually irrelevant. It still exists today, but there's a reason you never hear about it. Instead, political power in the Yishuv was mainly concentrated in the Assembly of Representatives and their executive committee, the Jewish National Council, led by Jerusalem Vice Mayor David Yelin. Though one shouldn't mistake them for a parliament. Their main job was to confer with the Palestinian government on issues affecting the Jewish community and to appoint the leaders of several other Zionist organs, the most important of which were the Zionist Executive, led by Friedrich Kish, responsible for finding housing, work, and education for Jewish immigrants, and the paramilitary Haganah, which officially managed internal security for Jewish settlements like kibbutzim. Unofficially, it did quite a bit more, but the British had some reassurance from its de facto commander Yitzhak Ben Zvi, since he'd always been a voice for calm and restraint within the Zionist left. Many members of the assembly were also members of the Histadrut, the Central Labor Council elected by Palestine's various trade unions, but theoretically open to the representation of all Jewish workers, led by David Ben-Gurion. The Histadrut's purpose was to regulate employment, wages, working conditions, and the overall promotion of Zionism in concert with social democracy. Though being an exclusively Jewish body in a country where Jews were the minority was beginning to hamper their negotiating power. Because most Jews in Palestine were irreligious, the chief rabbinate tends to be overlooked in retrospect. But since the 1922 Constitution had given religious authorities a monopoly on marriage and divorce, most Palestinian Jews had to deal with it at some point in their lives. The office of chief rabbi had existed for centuries, but the mandate had radically altered its character. Instead of a singular role traded back and forth between a handful of aristocratic families, the office was expanded to two chief rabbis, one Ashkenazi and one Sephardic, serving on a national rabbinate elected by a committee comprising municipal rabbis and the Jewish National Council, and then confirmed by both the Assembly of Representatives and the High Commissioner. I've said before that the distinction between Ashkenazi and Sephardic is more nebulous than most people realize, so the appointment of dual chief rabbis was and continues to be controversial. It was likely only done because Britain had two chief rabbis. Now, back when the Zionist organization had been important, it had established two bodies that dominated the landscape. Formed in 1902, the Anglo-Palestine Bank started out as the region's only real financial institution. The Zionist organization had also established the Jewish National Fund, a non-profit trust to buy and maintain land in Palestine, mostly in rural areas. While some JNF land was zoned for residential or commercial use, most of it was allocated for recreation and reforestation. So if you were a child in the 1960s and your childless aunt planted a tree in Israel in your name instead of giving you a real birthday present, this was how she did it. And while not an inherently Zionist institution, the Jewish sporting organization Maccabi had already established football teams in Palestine during the Ottoman period. And by the 1920s, they were competing semi-professionally against British soldiers and sailors. Between the organs of the Yishuv and the limited capabilities of Herbert Samuel's government, Palestine was beginning to look like a real functioning country. The Department of Health had partnered with medical NGOs and the American Zionist women's movement Hadassah in a long-term campaign to eradicate malaria. And by 1923, Palestine had not one but two electrical grids. Of course, none of this would mean anything without economic stimulus from Jewish immigration and foreign investment, and that had been a problem ever since the First World War. The Third Aliyah had seen a lull in immigration, with the vast majority of arrivals being returning refugees who'd fled or been expelled during the war. From the very earliest years of the Zionist movement, Palestine had been an unattractive prospect for Jewish immigrants in comparison to the much higher quality of life that awaited them in the United States. But in 1924, a miracle happened. The United States stopped letting them in. During the 1920s, the US underwent a political realignment very similar to what was going on in Britain. With the left in a long-term transitional period, electoral advantage fell to the conservative wing of the Republican Party, initiating a decade of isolationist backlash against the earlier progressive era. That's very much a story for another time, but for our purposes today, the end of the largely open immigration system, an institution of strict and racially motivated national quotas, reshaped Jewish migration patterns around the world. Suddenly, destinations that had once seemed less attractive were subject to entirely new waves of Jewish immigrants. Between 1918 and 1923, Palestine's Ministry of Customs and Revenue had only issued about 7,000 entry visas for Jewish immigrants. In 1925 alone, the number was 35,000. Welcome to the Fourth Aliyah. The change in migration patterns also changed the profile of a typical Ole. Far from the overwhelmingly young, idealistic, and working-class immigrants of previous eras, the Fourth Aliyah comprised a much more diverse spectrum of age, wealth, and education level. People for whom nation-building was secondary to ordinary life. They were also far less transient. In previous aliyahs, the majority of immigrants returned to their countries of origin within a couple years, but 75% of arrivals during this period stayed in Palestine permanently. Net immigration had risen so much, in fact, that the government and the Zionist executive agreed to start imposing restrictions, denying entry to communists, the indigent, and carriers of infectious disease. During the Third Aliyah, Zionist organizations abroad had begun to lose faith in the movement, but the Fourth Aliyah changed all that, resulting in an equally sudden flood of foreign investment and philanthropy. In 1922, an eccentric American named Yaakov Newman established the town of Ra'anana with dreams of an American metropolis that never was. A few kilometers to the north, Macy's co-owner Nathan Strauss helped establish the nascent resort town of Netanya by donating money he'd inherited after his brother Isidore died in the sinking of the Titanic. One thing that the latest wave of arrivals did have in common was that they overwhelmingly chose city living over the back-to-the-land ethos espoused by most early Zionists. Even among agrarian Zionists, disillusionment with the extreme, vaguely cultish anarcho-socialism of the kibbutz movement had spawned a new type of settlement in the moshav, where labor and profits were collectivized, but the people themselves were allowed to own their homes and live as families. And while the left continued to dominate rural life, it was a growing focus for more right-leaning figures like Rabbi Natan Milekovsky, who began writing a series of Galilee-focused calls to action under the pseudonym Netanyahu. But even in the rural interior, there was a general trend towards urbanization, as demonstrated when the American land corporation Amzik bought out the entire Arab village of Afula from its Lebanese owners and turned it into an administrative center for the Jewish population of the Jezreel Valley. But by far the majority of arrivals settled in existing cities, and one city in particular. While Jerusalem remained Palestine's capital and largest city, it was rapidly giving way to Haifa, Jaffa, and Tel Aviv as the main centers of commerce and culture. By the middle of the decade, Tel Aviv, which had been explicitly established as an artistic capital, had transformed into a physical embodiment of the Roaring Twenties, a dazzling reflection of Hemingway's Paris and Duke Ellington's Harlem. It had no past, only a future, as expressed in a vogue for the colorful, eclectic style of architecture. In 1923, the liberal newspaper Haaretz moved its headquarters from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv. When the world-famous actress Chana Rovina came to establish the Habima Theater, she did so in Tel Aviv. And when the foremost Zionist philosopher Ahad Ha'am finally immigrated, he settled in Tel Aviv. serving on the city council until his death in 1927. This was a moment of intense anxiety for leftist leaders who'd continued advocating for rural life and feared the political power of the urban middle class. But even most of them were living in Tel Aviv, and because of this, the city's population was growing faster than its expansion could be properly planned. In 1923, British engineer Frederick Palmer had proposed transforming Jaffa into a massive concrete harbor capable of hosting large ocean liners, aircraft carriers, and next-generation cargo ships. But that would require spending British money on Palestine, which was a no-go in Westminster. Developers could continue buying individual plots of land piecemeal, but this risked the city becoming unnavigable, overcrowded, and unsanitary. Enter Patrick Geddes. Born in Scotland and heavily influenced by sociology, environmentalism, and Hinduism, Geddes' work in British India popularized design principles that not only beautified cities, but improved health and safety for the people living in them. He was also an old friend of the Jewish territorialist leader Israel Zangwill, who, though no longer a Zionist himself, recommended Geddes to design the campus for the Hebrew University, which so impressed Zionist leaders that they hired him as a consultant on small projects all over the country. So in 1925, the city of Tel Aviv reached out to Geddes for a master plan that would alleviate housing pressures on the rapidly growing city. Geddes dismissed the idea of a major port at Jaffa, though to be fair, it was already clear that Haifa would fill that role. Instead, he created a master plan that embraced Tel Aviv's status as a playground for artists. Breakwaters were placed in front of the barren cliffsides to create an artificial beach. Tel Aviv was given its own small port near the mouth of the Yarkon River. And in between, Geddes laid out a future-proof network of superblocks divided by narrow but easily navigable thoroughfares. Within these blocks, he laid out small, staggered streets he called homeways to deter automobile traffic with small parks at their center. The blocks were also overlaid with cozy, mostly pedestrian boulevards in the style of Mexico City, linking large parks and cultural hubs with the Habima Theater as the focal point of the new city, all growing organically out of the existing built-up area. Until 1921, Tel Aviv had been part of the city of Jaffa, but following the riots that spring, the two cities were formally separated, and almost all of Jaffa's Jewish population relocated to Tel Aviv. However, Geddes made his master plan in the expectation that the two cities would someday reunite. Moreover, Geddes went on to recommend buying more land for Tel Aviv's expansion, as well as a suburban rail network serving Arabs and Jews alike. Not only had the mass influx of Jews resulted in their return to large areas of Jaffa, but Geddes was part of a political movement in Palestine that was really starting to gain traction.
Our relations towards the Arabs must rest on cosmic foundations. Our attitude toward them must be one of humanity, of moral courage, which remains in the highest plane, even if the behavior of the other side is not all that is desired. Indeed, their hostility is all the more reason for our humanity.
In 1919, Aharon David Gordon of the Agrarian Socialist Party Hapoel Hatzair wrote From the Outside, a response to the challenges facing Jewish farmers in the Galilee at the end of the First World War. Foremost among these challenges was a socio-economic paradox at the heart of the Zionist movement. From a historical perspective, most Jewish traditions are rooted in the agricultural cycles of ancient Judea. The cultural Zionist focus on returning to agriculture was thus framed as a means to break free of a history of foreign oppression and religious orthodoxy that had emerged as a consequence of separation from the land. But how does one do that? I'm being quite literal. Before the war, it had been illegal for Jews to buy state-owned land from the Ottoman government, so for the most part, Jewish organizations turned to private owners to purchase lands already occupied by Arab peasants. In the very earliest days of the movement, Jewish farmers had continued to employ Arabs on their farms, but liberal thinkers like Ahad Ha'am recoiled at their mistreatment, while socialists feared that the employment of Arab workers would create an ethnic class divide and perpetuate the Jewish people's traditional relegation to cities. So in strictly socialist settlements like the kibbutzim, it was common practice to evict the Arab peasantry and rely exclusively on Jewish labor. The problem with this should be obvious. In attempting to avoid creating economic inequality, they merely shifted it by putting Arabs out of work. In early 1922, Goldin proposed that all new kibbutzim and moshavim reserve an equitable amount of land for Arab farmers, but he died only days later and seemingly took the idea with him. Sir Herbert Samuel's government had made attempts to resettle them on new farms, but in many cases, the administration was unable to make deals in time or was rebuffed by local authorities and Arab landlords. Instead, dispossessed peasants almost invariably resettled in cities, mainly Haifa, where they increasingly competed with Jewish workers for low-wage industrial jobs. But at the same time, a new idea was coalescing within the Zionist movement, that the fulfillment of a Jewish homeland didn't necessarily entail a Jewish state. As early as 1918, Jerusalem's military governor Ronald Storrs had established the Pro-Jerusalem Society. Officially, it was just a civic improvement club which aimed to move people out of Jerusalem's crowded old city, turn it into a giant museum, and take its best attributes as inspiration for the development of the new city. For example, the requirement that new buildings use locally sourced limestone was originally a directive by Storrs. Essentially, it took the place of a city council, but the principles of its foundation were emblematic of binationalism, and it's notable that the governing council included Zionists, non-Zionists, anti-Zionists, and a whole lot of binationalists. At the same time, more explicit support for binationalism came from some unexpected places. Martin Buber was an Austrian Jewish anarchist philosopher and religious mystic who'd been involved in the Zionist movement since the 1890s, and, for obvious reasons, shared many of Goldin's views. But if anything, he was even more hostile to political nationalism than Goldin was, and he was never afraid to say so. In 1921, he greeted the 12th Zionist Congress in Carlsbad with a scathing rebuke. Nation-states, though born out of rebellion against empires, almost inevitably seem to become empires themselves. It happened to revolutionary France, it happened to ancient Rome, it'll happen to us. A national consciousness divorced from politics inspires art and innovation, but tied to politics, it'll quickly outlive its usefulness and either inspire a healthy backlash or consume the nation until it self-destructs. Though not exactly orthodox, Buber tied the mostly secular nature of the Zionist movement to the dangers posed by nationalism around the world. The Jewish people were more than simply a nation, and thus it behooved them to reject the quick and easy route of political nationalism for the sake of Zionism. If Buber provided the theory, practice emerged from three other titans of the movement. Chaim Margaliot Kalvarisky had been manager of the Palestine chapter of the Jewish Colonization Association, and thus the person primarily responsible for purchasing land for Jewish settlement. He might not seem like the most obvious skeptic of political Zionism, but his work gave him an unusually comprehensive view of the chaos that this process caused. As early as December 1920, Margaliot Kalvarisky had warned Samuel's advisory council that the current system of communal segregation needed to be abolished in favor of common institutions of language, education, and government. By the 1920s, Henrietta Zold had already secured her place in Jewish American history as the leaker of the 1883 Treffa Banquet, editor-in-chief of the Jewish Publication Society, and creator of the Jewish American Yearbook, but came to Palestine as founder and head of the Zionist Women's Health Initiative Hadassah, which was now working with the government to help eradicate malaria. Like Margaliot Kalvarisky, her work exposed her to the difficulties of civic improvement that could be alleviated by building greater trust between Arabs and Jews, a sentiment shared by fellow American Rabbi Judah Leib Magnus, newly appointed chancellor of the Hebrew University. Together they formed Brit Shalom, the official Jewish organization for binationalism, where they were soon joined by Attorney General Norman Bentwich and eventually High Commissioner Samuel himself, as well as receiving outside support from Albert Einstein and former British Colonial Secretary Winston Churchill. Brit Shalom wasn't a political party. Its members could be found all over the political spectrum, and even on this specific issue there were sharp divides. Most binationalists supported the establishment of an independent Palestine with Jews and Arabs as equal partners, while others believed Palestine should become a Jewish federal state within a united Syrian kingdom. And it shouldn't be a surprise to hear that most Zionist leaders didn't view binationalism kindly, but one major exception was Frederick Kish, president of the Zionist Executive, who saw the movement as an opportunity to elevate politicians on the Arab side who were more receptive to a compromise with Zionism. They didn't need to be Zionists. In fact, Kish and Margaliot Kalvarisky agreed that it would be better if they weren't, so long as they weren't anti-Zionists. And since so much of Palestinian Arab politics revolved around long-running feuds between and within powerful families, recruiting potential allies shouldn't be a problem. This culminated in the Muslim National Associations, a quasi-political party which initially posed a serious threat to the anti-Zionist Palestine Arab Congress. Unfortunately, Margaliot Kavarisky soon found that his new pet project was largely viewed by low-ranking Arab politicians as an easy way to solicit bribes from himself and Kish. What little promise there was in the group quickly fizzled out, and it remained on the margins of Arab politics. Insofar as there was any serious effort to reconcile the divergent politics of Jews and Arabs, it came from the emerging workers' movements. Under the leadership of David Ben-Gurion, the Histadrut was beginning to flex its muscles by creating institutions of its own to compete with the other organs of the Yishuv. Starting with the health insurance scheme Clalit, they soon established their own bank, construction company, newspaper, a network of Hapoel sports franchises to compete with Maccabi, and eventually its own shipping company. So too did the Histadrut begin concerning itself with how to reconcile its status as a Zionist institution with the rapid growth of the Arab proletariat, and the task fell to Yitzhak Ben-Tzvi. Ben-Tzvi spoke fluent Arabic and had written extensively about the non-Jewish peoples of Palestine. So in 1921, he published an essay arguing that the majority of Palestinian Arabs remained depoliticized and divided along lines of class, religion, and way of life. Accordingly, he claimed that Palestinian Arab nationalism was a fundamentally top-down movement, organized by bourgeois elites to suppress Arab class consciousness by using Zionism as an economic scapegoat. Although Ben-Tzvi's assessment was outdated and exaggerated, there were some kernels of truth in his argument. The Palestine Arab Congress was composed almost entirely of self-appointed activists and politicians, usually hailing from aristocratic and bourgeois families that had held political power for generations. While Zionist political parties had existed in the region since the turn of the century, the Congress had yet to form any of its own, despite severe internal disagreements over Palestine's future status. More often than not, the wealthy landowners bankrolling the Congress had been more than happy to sell real estate to Jewish settlers. At the same time, the Palestinian government's campaign to eradicate malaria had resulted in the draining of coastal swamplands near Haifa, and when High Commissioner Herbert Samuel planned to lease the new land for Jewish settlement, the largest outcry came not from the local villagers, but their absentee landlords in the Congress. In that spirit, Ben-Tzvi concluded that the Histadrut should take a proactive approach to the Arabs. The most obvious place to start was in the public sector, particularly the railways, where Arab and Jewish workers already collaborated in large numbers. While the Histadrut remained open only to Jewish workers, Chairman David Ben-Gurion was eager to incorporate Arab workers into trade unionism, since their exclusion had consistently undermined the union's bargaining power and depressed wages. However, he maintained that because the Arab sector was still far less urbanized and the Histadrut was committed to being a Zionist institution, cooperation between Arabs and Jews at the highest level should be done through separate workers' councils. This came to a head in 1924. Following the failed parliamentary elections of the previous year, High Commissioner Samuel immediately began negotiations with Jewish and Arab leaders to create a new electoral system for the Palestinian legislature. I was unable to find any details about this proposal, but the discussion around it seems to suggest that the new parliament would be more democratic and more powerful, a truer reflection of Samuel's original vision than the British Colonial Office had initially allowed. Jewish binationalists were unequivocal in their support. Yes, a directly elected legislature would be majority Arab, but the Jewish right of return would remain untouched, since it was already guaranteed by international law. And perhaps fearful that their influence was waning, the Palestine Arab Congress was far more open to compromise than it had been before. But just as Ben-Gurion used the language of class struggle to promote cooperation with Arab workers, so too he used it to reject the new legislature. Who were the members of the Arab Congress but bourgeois business owners and feudal aristocrats? By what right did they claim to represent the masses? Were they not the enemy of the Arab worker? Achdut HaAvodah rejected the proposal, and since they were the largest party, the wider Jewish leadership was unable to come to an agreement. Once again, Samuel's parliament wasn't to be. This rejection only served to muddle the Zionist left's policy on Arab relations, opening the much-coveted railway workers for radicalization by the Jewish-led but anti-Zionist Palestine Communist Party, soon joined by the Palestine Arab Workers' Society, an Arab counterpart to the Histadrut which opposed both the Zionists and the Communists. For the remainder of the decade, the Histadrut would attempt to recapture the Arab workers' movement, but the opportunity had been lost. The Histadrut's conflicting ideals were particularly offensive to Jacob de Haan, a Jewish lawyer, journalist, and Zionist activist who had immigrated from the Netherlands some years earlier. Originally a labor Zionist, then a binationalist, de Haan's arrival in Palestine had led to a religious reawakening, embracing the hardcore anti-Zionism of Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld and the ultra-Orthodox Haredim. This is interesting for two reasons. First, de Haan was openly gay, and even after his religious awakening carried on affairs with not only other men, but Arab men. One has to wonder what Sonnenfeld thought of that. Second, his prior history as a Zionist advocate in Europe gave the Haredi bloc a clout that it had never previously enjoyed. In June 1924, shortly after Achdut HaAvoda's rejection of the new parliament, de Haan prepared to leave for London to lobby the Colonial Office to reconsider rescinding the Balfour Declaration when he was shot and killed. The assassin, Avraham Tehomi, had acted on the orders of Yitzhak ben Zvi. Indeed, for all the efforts in the Yishuv to move away from political nationalism, an even larger movement was rising to embrace it even more fully, beginning in 1923, when the Mandate of Palestine was partitioned to create the Emirate of Transjordan. During the Paris Peace Conference, the British had pushed for a Sharifian solution to the partition of the Levant and Mesopotamia. Rather than divide the Ottoman territories up as the spoils of war, Britain and France would only take some small coastal enclaves while the remainder would be divided between King Faisal of Syria and two of his brothers. But in the course of negotiations, this plan was quashed by France, who insisted on taking all of northern Syria as its own League of Nations mandate. So in 1921, British and Arab representatives met in Cairo to come up with a second Sharifian solution, whereby the deposed Faisal would become king of Iraq, while his brother Abdullah would be made emir of the Transjordan, which would be under Palestinian suzerainty but distinct from Palestine itself. Up to this point, most Zionist leaders had assumed that some amount of land east of the Jordan would be a permanent part of Palestine. It had historically been part of ancient Judea and played important roles in Jewish history. Zionist representatives at the Paris Peace Conference had pushed for a Palestine extending as far east as the Hejaz Railway, and the Transjordan had been allocated to Palestine in the Treaty of Sèvres, hadn't it? The entire conceit of League of Nations mandates was that they were nation-states in the making. What right did the British have to slice a chunk of it off for the benefit of a random monarch who wasn't even from there? In truth, plans for a separate Transjordan had always been in the cards. Its status was outlined in the mandate. The 1922 Constitution had clearly set it aside from the rest of the territory, and subsequent arbitration by the League of Nations over the status of Lebanon had confirmed that the mandates could be partitioned. Modern Transjordan didn't even have a Jewish population until after partition, with the arrival of Jewish workers and engineers for the Naharaim hydroelectric plant. And while most Zionist leaders had hoped to hold on to some amount of territory east of the river, almost all of them were ultimately willing to part with it. Almost. Like many of the leading binationalists, Ze'ev Jabotinsky had been part of the Zionist movement since the first Aliyah, and combined extreme charisma with a healthy skepticism of popular narratives. Born to a wealthy, assimilated Jewish family in Odessa, he'd first participated in the Zionist Congress in 1903, where he immediately found a home in the liberal opposition to Theodor Herzl. In the wake of the Kishinev pogrom, he'd helped establish the Liberal Jewish Self-Defense Organization, though credit for this was shamefully stolen from him by Chaim Weizmann, which must have been awkward since Jabotinsky ended up living in Weizmann's house during his wartime stint in London. Returning to Palestine as part of the Jewish Legion, Jabotinsky was arrested and convicted by British authorities for leading a militia to defend Jews in Old Jerusalem during the Nebi Musa riots, leading Achdut HaAvodah to protest by placing him at the top of their party list during elections to the Jewish Assembly. As part of Herbert Samuel's new administration, Jabotinsky was pardoned, and unfortunately for Achdut HaAvodah, He was no socialist. During the Nebi Musa riots, Jabotinsky had laughably been labeled as a Bolshevik, but in the eyes of certain Palestinian administrators, he'd since taken on the reputation of a budding fascist, someone whose sole loyalty was to the idea of an independent Jewish state, and for whom any means could be justified in service of that goal, including the uncompensated dispossession, expulsion, or permanent subjugation of the Arab population. And to be fair, there were Jews in Palestine who had views like that and who gravitated toward Jabotinsky in the belief that he shared them. But he didn't. If you've watched this channel for the past couple of years, it should be clear that most Zionist political visions were guided by the examples of other countries. Ahad Ha'am viewed Britain as a model, being a modern society built on ancient cultural foundations. David Ben-Gurion took cues from Austrian liberals and socialists, particularly his vision for Jewish and Arab autonomy within contiguous areas of settlement as a precursor to national independence. But with the possible exceptions of Zold and Magnus, Jabotinsky's Zionism was uniquely informed by American liberalism, or at least his second-hand impression of American liberalism: the free market, the rule of law, and the melting pot. However, the triumph of those values depended not on any inherent goodness of America's people, or even the bounty of its economy, but its power. And in November 1923, Jabotinsky wrote an article for the Russian Zionist magazine Razvet outlining a new type of Zionism based on this model. Dispelling any accusations of anti-Arab feeling, Jabotinsky declared that peace and harmony with the Arabs was not only possible, but morally absolute. However, he also believed that such a peace would only be possible through victory, over the British, over the Arabs, over doubt. To believe that Arab leaders would lay down their national ambitions, even for the elevation of their material conditions, wasn't only naive, but insulting. These people were no different from us, and deny it as others might, the Arab national consciousness was here. They fully understood Zionist intentions, and if the Zionists had been in their position, they would have reacted with the same hostility. For all the historic connections between Palestine and the Jewish people, most Jews arriving in Palestine were in practice strangers, and no nation in history had ever consented to its own colonization. Only when Jews constituted a decisive majority in Palestine would the Arabs make peace. There would be no need for anyone to leave the country, no question of their rights as citizens, and no denial of the opportunities afforded by a modern democracy. In fact, Jabotinsky would later elaborate that a future Jewish state should never make its Jewishness explicit in law, and that Arabs should be entitled to both communal autonomy and a mandate to share power in any coalition government. But until that time, the show must go on. Zionist colonization must either stop or else proceed regardless of the native population, which means that it can proceed and develop only under the protection of a power that is independent of the native population, behind an iron wall which the native population cannot breach. And we are all of us, without any exception, demanding day after day that the British should carry out this task vigorously and with determination. In this matter, there is no difference between our militarists and our vegetarians, except that the first prefer that the iron wall should consist of Jewish soldiers, and the others are content that they should be British. That same year, Jabotinsky established the Zionist youth group Betal, which was both a reference to the doomed final battle of the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 and a tribute to the late Josef Trumpeldor. I'm sure that the anarcho-communist Trumpeldor would have appreciated being the namesake of a right-wing organization, as well as the misspelling of his name. And in 1925, with new elections to the assembly looming, Jabotinsky permanently broke with both Achdut HaAvoda and the General Zionists to form his own party, the Alliance of Revisionist Zionists, or Hatzoar. On the 6th of December 1925, the Yishuv held its second ever election for the assembly, with some changes. To account for the massive influx of Jewish immigrants, the threshold for political parties was doubled from 80 votes to 160. Unlike in the 1920 election, the Haredi party would no longer receive double votes to compensate for their opposition to women's suffrage, leading to a Haredi boycott of elections that would continue for the next 20 years. So too was the election boycotted by the communists. So despite a huge increase in the Jewish population, turnout was quite low, with fewer representatives elected than in 1920. This turned out to be hugely beneficial to the Social Democrats, though they still fell short of an outright majority. Hatzoar came in a distant fourth, but the success of the new party also compelled the center and left to take a more hawkish position on Jewish-Arab relations. On the 30th of June 1925, Sir Herbert Samuel officially stepped down as High Commissioner. Samuel was proud to have established some degree of peace and prosperity, if not order, and initially planned to settle permanently in Haifa. However, his successor emphatically ordered him to return to Britain. But who was his successor? Back at the end of the war, Israel Zangwill had suggested John Monash, the Australian Jewish general who had essentially figured out how to fight modern battles and end the war. But for various reasons, the British Colonial Office had concluded that appointing a Jewish High Commissioner had been a mistake. And anyway, Monash had no interest in Zionism beyond passive encouragement from the comfort of Melbourne. But he knew someone who might be right for the job. On the 25th of August, Field Marshal Herbert Plumer arrived in Palestine. Where Samuel was a career politician, Plumer was a career military man. Where Samuel was a liberal with Labourite tendencies, Plumer was a resolute conservative. And of course, where Samuel was Jewish, Plumer was Anglican. As High Commissioner, Plumer's policies weren't actually that different from Samuel's, but these superficial differences made it far easier for him to govern. Having no apparent sympathies to Zionism or Arab nationalism quickly earned him the respect of leaders in both camps, and made it all the easier to establish institutions of governance. Just before leaving office, Samuel had finally succeeded in establishing Palestinian citizenship, which Plumer followed up with an immensely controversial decision to change the country's name in Hebrew. Let me explain. For all of modern history up to this point, the region shown on this map had been known in English as Palestine, in Arabic as Philastin, and in Hebrew as Eretz Yisrael. To be absolutely clear, this had never been a point of conflict or controversy. Though Eretz Yisrael had a different etymology from Philastin, this was just how different languages referred to the same thing. Anyone who says that either Israel or Palestine are 20th century neologisms is either wrong or lying. And if that doesn't make sense, let me ask, what does your native language call this country? However, by the time the Palestine Post was ready to start printing its own stamps, the use of Eretz Yisrael had become a bargaining chip for Arab nationalist leaders, leading to the adoption of Palestina in Hebrew. As a compromise, the initials Aleph Yod were appended to the name in all Hebrew lettering on stamps, official government documents, and money. Oh yeah, money! Plumer's administration also created the Palestine Pound, which was indirectly pegged to the value of the British pound, though unlike in Britain, the Palestinian pound was decimal. A national currency was essential to maintaining the economic growth that had defined the mid-1920s, but it still had a long way to go. A typical skilled worker in Palestine still only made £1 a month, less than a tenth the wages of their counterparts in London. But where Samuel had struggled to resettle Arabs displaced by Jewish land purchases, Plumer solved the problem by giving government-owned land to Arabs for free. The question remained, how much of Palestine's newfound peace and prosperity was the result of good fortune? Could the new administration and new economy handle an actual crisis? On the afternoon of the 11th of July 1927, a magnitude 6.3 earthquake struck the Jordan Valley near Jericho, causing destruction in multiple cities and killing at least 287 people. Jews were injured and lost homes in Jerusalem and Tigania, but incredibly none were killed. Nevertheless, Jewish philanthropists abroad were ready and willing to assist the mostly Arab victims, especially in the US, where the term pro-Palestine was commonly used as a synonym with Zionist. Nathan Strauss, namesake of Netanya, donated $5,000 to humanitarian aid, prompting Kish and the Zionist executive to raise £100,000 as a show of good faith. At the same time, however, At least one Arab organization in Nablus had actively solicited donations from another American philanthropist, Henry Ford. And despite the best intentions to mend fences, the months after the earthquake saw a growing number of labor disputes between Arabs and Jews. In the year to come, those disputes would turn religious. There was a reason Herbert Samuel wrote of his departure the way that he did. The underlying political issue was unsolved but remained quiescent. There had been no disturbances for a long time. Special thanks to my patrons, including Mir Akbar Ali, Jeremy Biskin, Boris Cherny, FC, Matthew Feinberg, Jay Fleischman, Oshar Gordon, Bob Huddy, Raphael Kellerman, Sol Cohn, Jacob Kossoff, Eric Liederman, and Jeffrey Schweitzer.